Hello, I'm Jerry Kirkpatrick, and I'm teaching the fundamentals of metal shaping. And this is a 1953 Ford pickup that I got back in 2012. That year I was chasing the USAC Western States Championship, which we won, and kind of put this thing aside for quite some time. Here it is, 2018, in September, 1st of September, and I've decided to get it in and get it running and just make it safe and reliable. Those are the only two criteria I have. The fellow that owned it before put a 351 Cleveland in it and a C6 transmission. Both were done very poorly, but if I can clean everything up and make it safe, I'll be happy with that. It was last registered in 1997, so almost 20 years it's been sitting. I got it out of a junkyard, very cheap, and brought it in. I tried to get it running back in 2012, and I just couldn't get it to run smoothly at all. So I just put it back on my east pasture over here and just brought it back out last month, right at the end of the month. So all I've done so far is I put a MSD coil on it, new points, condenser, plugs, plug wires, and rebuilt the carburetor, and it runs great. It idles smoothly. The lowest compression I have is 145. The best I have is 165, so we're right in there. I did put some seafoam in it, in the crankcase, in with the motor oil, and I'll run it for a while and see if that straightens it out. I've had some pretty good luck with using seafoam. So this will be the first of kind of a series. I don't know if I want to call it a series. It's more of as I do different things and they merit showing either a different way or the way I would approach a particular problem. I'll go ahead and film it and post it, but I will be doing a considerable amount of body work on it. I don't think I'm going to do much more than use primer on it. Might color the primer, but I've got a 1956 Ford pickup out in the field also, and that's my primary. That's really what I'm wanting to do. I really like the looks of a 56 over the 53 to 55s. So like I say, if I can get this running safely and reliably, I'll use this as kind of a second vehicle. I have a Mazda pickup also. I'll just drive this around to pick up parts and such, and then get to work on my 56. So like I say, this is just the beginning of several that I'll be making, and this particular one is on replacing, or actually installing, a motor mount. He has the cross member that it looked like he got from mid-50s, over in Arizona who they sell mainly 50 through 56 pickup truck parts. The motor mount looks like they bought it from the same place. So anyhow, when he put the two cross members in, he used the motor mounts on the front on the motor, but bolted the transmission right straight to the cross member, which is ridiculous, but that's the way it was done. And I found those types of things that had been done throughout the truck as I've looked at it. One of the very first things that I noticed when I started on this was that every time he needed to replace or add a wire or whatever, it was always blue 18 gauge. So I ripped the whole wiring harness out and made my own harness and wrapped it and reinstalled it. So the electrical now is good. So that's about it. As you can see here, the transmission was just sitting right on the cross member without a transmission mount, and the transmission cross member was just sitting on top of the frame with a couple of bolts. The bolts that were holding the transmission in didn't even have any lock washers or flat washers or anything else. So we're going to remedy that whole deal, and I'm going to put a transmission mount in it now, and I'll show you how that's done. And here are the bolts and nuts that were holding the cross member in. As you can see, some of them are coarse, some of them are fine. The lock washer got split on the one on the left there, and that it was just left like that. I don't understand. And if you look at the nut on the right, it's larger than any of the others, so that meant I had to get out from under the truck, go get a different wrench just for that one bolt. I hate that when it happens. And here you can see the mount as it came out of the truck. It ain't real pretty, but we'll clean it up and make it look at least a little bit better than what we got here. And luckily I had in my overstock a Ford transmission mount, and you can see that the bolts that were in the transmission will not fit in the two holes on the outer portion of the transmission mount. So I'm going to have to drill those holes out to accept the larger bolts. So let's get on to getting something done. After about a half hour of cleaning with Simple Green and wire brush and all that stuff, I got it fairly clean, and you can see that the holes in the transmission mount are the proper distance, 5.5 inches center to center, but they're 4 3/8 bolts. So they're going to have to be drilled out to the 1/2 inch bolt, maybe a 9/16 clearance. So this portion, this face, will sit or bolt to the transmission, And if you look at the job they did on, let's say, oversizing the holes in the cross member, you can see those are going to have to be cleaned up quite a bit also. Here's the bottom of the transmission mount, and I'm going to be using Allen screws, 1/2 inch, to bolt the transmission mount to the transmission. So I'm going to have to drill a 13/16 hole on center of the mounting holes that are on the opposite side. A 13/16 hole here and a 13/16 hole here. And as you can see, the original holes in the transmission mount don't line up with the two cross member mounts. So I'm going to have to figure how I want to either elongate or drill some new holes either in the mount or the cross member to affix the bottom portion of the transmission mount to the top of the cross member. So here's the transmission mount all finished up. This is the bottom, well actually it would be the top that bolts this way to the transmission, to the bottom of the transmission. And if you noticed when you looked at this before, there was quite a bit of rubber that had been vulcanized and then left askew on the bottom of the mount, and I got rid of that so I would have a nice flat mating surface both on the transmission and on the cross member. And I'm not going to go into a long dissertation on irregular mating. So here is the, I guess would be the bottom portion that goes onto the transmission mount. Here you can see that I've made the holes big enough for the heads of the Allen screws that will be bolting this to the transmission. And I found that if I drill these two holes here, they are towards the innermost portion of these slots. And obviously I won't be able to get my hand in there to put the nuts on the top side. So I've cut a piece of 18 gauge, the same length as the transmission mount, drilled a couple of holes matching the bolt pattern in the bottom portion of the transmission mount. I then tack welded a couple of nuts to the piece of 18 gauge, and then I bolted the nut plate to the transmission mount and then cut it to just the inside of each of these holes where the head of the Allen screw goes through, and then put a short tack weld on each one. And now the nuts are captured on the inside of that channel, and I don't have to reach in there to try and get this thing bolted up. So here's the transmission mount and cross member back in place, and bolted in. Use some nice new bolts on both sides, and have the transmission mount, the cross member, bolted in under the chassis, and you may think that having this big cutout in here is not so good. But if you think about it, the transmission bolts are here and here, which are outside of each of the cuts. That puts the load out here and wants this to buckle. But we have the transmission mount bolts through the cross member fairly narrow, and that pulls this back up. Therefore, it spreads the load out well past both of these cuts. So I elected not to do anything with this cutout. So by adding the thickness of that transmission mount, I've gained some clearance between the motor and the firewall. You can see over there on the far side that little round piece sticking up out of the intake manifold. That and also the valve cover were actually rubbing on the firewall. So now I won't have that noise to contend with. One of my next projects, I guess, will be to replace the exhaust, the mufflers on this thing. But I've looked through a lot of the internet and all of the catalogs that I have, and I'm having trouble finding a muffler with the same amount of patina as the original. If there are specific things that you would like to see or hear, or any questions, make sure you leave those questions below the description, and I'll try and get back with you. Thanks for watching.